So let's open it out to questions to the floor. Enough of us speaking. Has anybody got any questions, any points of clarification, or want to share any experiences you've had yourselves? There's a roving mic.
Hello. So I'm from Surrey. There's a place called Newlands Corner. You may have walked there on the North Downs. There was a big community struggle with the council basically putting a car park charge on the land. They've all gone up in arms and everyone's now protesting, so they now don't attend the site because they don't want to pay to go there because they've never paid there before. Now, it's on a private estate anyway, so their rights were never really there in the first place. But I completely agree, this is how we need to fund it, but this seems to be what's happening. I don't know if it's to do with education or lack of education, but it just seems that when you actually put some charges in, which is meant to be for the benefit of the Wildlife Trust there, for the maintenance costs, the public doesn't want to get involved in that. They seem to think it's just a money-grabbing scheme for the county council. So how can we get around that?
Any, Peter?
Charging for car parking is always a hot potato. And most cities, I think, are really exploring that at this point of time. A lot of consultation beforehand. Manchester, for example, has been charging at Heaton, but they had a 8-month lead into that. Milton Keynes Parks Trust do the same when you go abroad. It is a common practice. We have to find different ways to resource these public benefits and public services, and that is one way. There is often, I think, a pain barrier that organisations, local authorities or trusts go through, but that is reduced through the careful introduction, the careful management, the pitching of charges, and also the flexible charging model that sometimes includes free days or uncharged hours, particularly those that are walking dogs for half hour or what have you. So there are ways to generate income through that particular model, but to do that in quite a carefully planned and carefully structured manner.
I'm not sure whether this is an actual question. You were talking about volunteers, and you were all talking about volunteers, and you're correct. In austerity, we need people to volunteer, we need people to take an interest in their environment, but not just the fact that volunteers die. Some volunteer groups are very insular, they won't give any data away, so all that data becomes lost. I'm an ecological consultant, and I think that who is accountable if volunteers make big mistakes and pollution happens or something doesn't happen that should have happened? Who's then accountable for that? And should we be looking to people like myself to educate volunteers? But obviously it's a job for me.
I don't know if either of you want to comment. Well, I was just going to say, absolutely. I mean, I think where volunteer models are working well, it's where funding has been secured for somebody to help manage the volunteers, which it's not the kind of the be all and end all, but it's also not as expensive as I think it's perceived to be. And I think that's where that is happening. It may be there may be scope for a transition, but I don't think we know enough about it, to be honest. I absolutely agree that accountability is an issue, and I'm not sure that there's been enough research done on it. I know that there's I think Groundwork are doing some work at the moment about how to try and get younger people more involved in volunteering, but in terms of how that kind of accountability kind of is taken, it's really difficult. I think there was certainly in Sheffield there's been a high profile court case that has come up where the group themselves have been found liable to cover costs, and that's we don't know how that is playing out at the moment, so we'll be watching that with interest. But Peter, I don't know if you have any experience.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you two parts to an answer. One is that the engagement with communities and a lot more volunteering is the sort of immediate short-term solution to all funding problems that will just get friends groups to step in and fill the gap. Now, Newcastle, as part of their Parks Trust model, will work much more collaboratively with friends groups. But they've undertaken, with the help of the National Trust, quite a complex piece of risk management, looking at tasks, looking at activities, looking at insurances, so that that has a more formal structure to it and minimises the potential levels of risk. Now, the second half of the answer, I think, is a much more longer term and more strategic opportunity here. And you can look at particularly increasing densification, much more, a greater reduction in private space. And so our public parks and public green space have the potential of being much more co-owned by communities. And when you look at organisations, and I gave you Neal Parks Trust as one example, but there are a number of organisations that are grasping that opportunity much more strategically, and that you're not just bringing in volunteers to do piecemeal activities or some of the more superficial or easy, low-hanging fruit of management. You're actually structuring it in a way that they are quite an integral part of your management team, and that includes back office, that includes people with accountancy skills, that includes people who have the ability to work as youth opportunity, youth training, a whole range of mechanisms to use parks in a much more structured manner for a wider set of community sectors. And so I think you have to look much more comprehensively, and the examples are in Australia, the examples are in America as well as the UK, where volunteering is taken to a much more strategic level and is much more embedded with formal management rather than being just a means to offload certain activities.
Hello, my name is Alina Baczyńska. Looking at it from a volunteer's point of view, where can these community groups look for support, funding, financing? Are there any resources that you could point us to get better at this and to help us where the local authorities don't immediately come up with funding?
I can certainly give you examples, again, based at a city level. Voluntary Action in Sheffield, it's Voluntary Action Sheffield. They are an NGO, charitable organisation that will help support volunteer groups on some of the issues around roles and responsibilities that have to kind of be taken on. Some of the legal ramifications. So there may be some kind of equivalence where you're based, I would say. I don't know if...
So I don't know if it's relevant, but in some places now GPs are creating social prescribing, if you heard this, or green prescribing, and they're saying that, for your ailment, you need to join the local voluntary group doing X. And I think there is more and more some level of funding associated with that so that the voluntary groups can maintain that service as health prevention or as treatment. So there's a lot of stuff on, if you Google green prescribing, social prescribing, you might find some. I don't know too much of the details, but I think it's relevant.
And just to also add, at the national scale, there is the, for parks and green spaces, there's the National Federation of Parks and Green Spaces that can provide support at that, kind of national scale. And there is if not full-time, part-time member of staff, I think, as a kind of who can give advice, calling on Sarah Royal, Sarah Royal, kind of acting as that kind of go-between in terms of finding funding and finding, kind of ways of building capacity. That could be a good point of call.
Hello, this is a fantastic topic for a book. If there isn't one already, you should be doing that. I'm involved in drawing up the urban design framework for one of the designated garden towns, and obviously we're putting in all sorts of things, from suds right through to pocket parks and verges and street trees and rain gardens and community orchards and all of these things. Now we're having to negotiate with house builders, and the first thing that they're going to say is, do you really want us to contribute to all this lot? What's in it for us? Aren't you wasting space, etc., etc., etc.? So some of these arguments are very, very pertinent that you're talking about, especially the value of green space. But just really on that, any particular advice that I can wheel out to my increasingly difficult discussions with hard-nosed housing providers?
Yes. It is no disrespect to if there are any in the audience, but it is I find them very hard to engage at times. I think maybe to this is with my committee on climate change hat. So we just published a report on housing and how we think housing should be designed to deal with climate change pressures in the future. So some house builders say some of the houses we build now are already overheating in the summer. And that means you're already causing health problems. It's not a problem in 20 years, 30 years' time where you don't care. And if you planted the trees in the right place, in the right distance to the building, you could counteract some of that. And if you look at DEFRA and Office of National Statistics have published urban natural capital accounts, and there are lots of modeling work in there that shows how effective the street trees are in reducing urban heat impact. So you can approach it both from the design of an individual house and the kind of costs that you can save to the occupants, if not to the design of the house. But I think it applies to the design, and also approach it from the very top, very nationally showing the importance of investing in these things. But even at the committee, we find it very hard to have that engagement, which goes to show that environment is not just for DEFRA. It's not just for environmental policy. MHCLG needs to engage much more with these things and push their sector much forward. I go to these events all the time and they never come and speak. Even Treasury turns up more often, which is quite interesting. I don't mean to be negative, but there are lots of different push and pull, and people, house buyers, if they are a bit better informed about how adaptive their new homes that they're buying, and how much what they're going to see out of their homes, they might push to builders. And also NHS has some work they've done. I think they're now requiring in their procurement that there needs to be green space around the new hospital buildings, because there is so much evidence that if the patients see greenery outside, even if they look at a picture of greenery, that they recover much faster. So there are lots of small things happening, I think, that might help.
I'll chip in two things. One is the book is already written. Nicola's written it. Placekeeping. Probably need a second edition.
I know. Where is it? Sold out.
Yeah.
I'll give you the details later.
The second half of it is that there are lessons in history when we look back at the original garden village and garden city models, and you have, say, Letchworth Heritage Trust. There are organisations set up with a clear governance to manage the community infrastructure, green, as well as some of the other community assets in perpetuity. Now, these new garden villages and garden suburbs often aren't going to be adopted by local authorities, so a long-term governance structure is needed. And I think the means to engage with your house builders is to set that as a requirement, partly through planning, but also to look at a mechanism through service charging which can be equitably set, to structure that in the long term and to ideally endow it early on. And so that a trust model, I think, is incredibly helpful in this. And we've got some great examples, one or two that I showed in my presentation, but history also gives us models to learn from.
Hello, Amy Burbage from North Northants Joint Planning Unit. We've got a garden village as well. But I was going to ask about that kind of management companies taking on green space in new developments and people being residents having to pay a maintenance charge. Often people feel like that's them paying 2 lots of council tax, and it can be really difficult. And I'm just wondering whether there's any work with these management companies, because there's a lot of different ones. I know for Upton, the site in Northampton, there's 8 different management companies on one site. But I think the natural capital account could actually be a really good way of sending a message to people about what their money buys. You know, what is it giving for them, rather than it's just this is paying for someone to collect the dog bins and this is somewhere for your children to play. It's actually the health and well-being assets that they're paying into. So I just didn't know if there was any work there that was being done.
I don't know whether you know. I don't know of any particularly with management companies, but it's an area to develop.
If there is enough data that you can link to how people are using green space and what kind of background sort of health data there is in a park or in a green space, then it is possible. The calculation is very simple. The main thing is to have the data. And in lots of cases, we have to transfer data from the national level and adjust it for the local. Now, I can't promise you that you can do that transfer for a small green space, for a small community. But what you can do is to use the narrative of these kind of benefits. People usually satisfied in some circumstances where you tell the story of what the numbers would have told if you had the numbers. So don't we can't value everything at every level, but things will improve. There'll be more data, more accounts repeated, more data will come on board, and it is possible to make the argument. Yeah.
So maybe one more question. Thank you.
Susan May, Clarion Housing Group, is more of a discussion point than a question, but just following on from the gentleman who's talking about a garden town and wanting to engage with developers in a way that's robust. So I've been looking at developing for our organisation a place shaping primer. So I've deliberately gone for the terminology of place shaping as opposed to place making, which is kind of almost like a halfway house towards place keeping. So I was very interested in that. But we've been looking at things like the Garden City Principles and seeing that they have been mentioned in the NPPF as being, that there is a link and that they're worth pursuing. Also, sort of my background, I've come across things like design codes. That if they're set at a very early stage and if you have sufficiently robust principles behind them, they can be used to shape the value of the land at the outset. And I think when developers come to a scheme, they've already got the land is optioned in and the costs already constrained to a certain density and type of development. So if you can constrain those things right at the beginning before the land value is captured, then it all kind of works its way out because it's worked its way out through the land value. So I don't know how early on you are, but obviously if you can build those things in at a very, very early stage, then that can kind of help you to give a framework. I've just been in a session over here where we were talking to developers and they were saying we'd really, really like to, but we need a steer. We need a very strong framework from government. We need boundaries within which we know those are the rules of the game and then we'll do it. But if you don't give them any boundaries or rules, then really the profit motive and optimization will just lead them to just go straight to what they can achieve for their shareholders. So that's my comment. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you. I don't know whether you've got any last minute
I will just chip in at the end of this that I think that the funding models are going to get much more sophisticated going forwards in the sense that it's not just private or public, it's more hybrid, but it has to be struck fairly. And I think when you look at some of the most successful models, they unite capital investment, the cost of building, with revenue, the cost of managing, in a much more integrated way, and often based around property value. And so you'll have a property tax, particularly in the US, across cities, and Melbourne, a number of Australian cities, looking at a means to fund that management. It's sort of a three-way question here. And history has some good examples. The Commons, Putney and Wimbledon has a property tax within 3/4 of a mile for some of the upkeep. The Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park now has a banded property tax to fund that. I think the area-based taxing or income generation has some real potential if struck fairly, but also at the outset of planning. So you have to look at both your capital expenditure and your revenue income. And if you're looking for a silver bullet, you need to build an endowment into the model that is funded through natural capital accounting that generates that income in perpetuity to manage the upkeep. Nirvana, we might get to it.
And with the final comment?
Yeah, so there are some new players in the game as well. So the people who say work investors, so impact investors, responsible investors, sustainable investors, look out for these people. They have a lot of money and they want to measure their impact that they're having either in social terms or environmental terms. We have the evidence, we have the metrics, but we haven't managed to bring these people to you. But look out for them. They're looking for projects. They're looking for renovation and maintenance. Maybe next year we'll get them on talking to us as well.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks everybody for the questions, and thank you to Peter and to Ece for the fascinating talks.